Thank you for joining us. Vanderbilt University's Chancellor Daniel Diermeier will now begin the event.
Thank you for joining me today for an important discussion on the crisis in Afghanistan. After 20 years and over $2 trillion invested in the lives of almost 2,500 American personnel lost, the US government decided over the last month to withdraw our troops and let the Afghan government and military stand on its own. We've all seen the images with the withdrawal. We saw the collapse of the Afghan government, the Taliban's swift takeover of authority, and many shocking and disturbing images of chaos on the ground. And then, of course, this only today we've heard about the terrible bombing at the airport. There has been significant criticism of the Biden administration's decision. There's also been a stern defense from the Biden administration. We're going to look into all of that. As Afghanistan faces an uncertain future, and as we want to think about the broader implications for national security and US foreign policy. Today, the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy joins me to host a panel of historians and foreign policy experts to offer their analysis of the Afghanistan crisis, and including, in particular, implications, as I just mentioned, for US national security and regional relationships, as well as an exploration of the human cost and effects of the conflict. I am very pleased to have an important guest and friend of Vanderbilt on the panel, Lieutenant General Scott Howell, with the US Air Force, who is was the 15th commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. General Howell was commanding general of NATO Special Operations Component Command and Special Operations Joint Task Force for Afghanistan on the ground from 2012 to 2013, and then again from 2016 to 2017, with several trips across the region since. He has deep understanding of the complexities of the conflict, both militarily and politically, and his expertise is really second to none. So the Vanderbilt University is grateful for your time today, General. Joining Lieutenant General Howell are three Vanderbilt professors with distinct perspectives. First is Tom Schwartz. He's a professor and renowned historian of foreign relations of the United States. He has taught at Vanderbilt for 30 years on international inclusion, including courses on the history of the Vietnam War. And as we just talked about, a very popular course this semester as well as on power and diplomacy in the modern Middle East. Thank you, Tom, for joining us. Joining him is Summer Ali, who is the co-chair of the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy and a research professor of law and political science. Her specialization lies at the intersection of national security, economic development, conflict mediation, and human rights. And finally, Mike Newton will lead our conversation today. He is a professor of international law. He's an expert on terrorism, transnational justice, and the conduct of hostility issues, as well as post-conflict accountability. He is on the council list at the International Criminal Court, supported United Nations agencies, and provided technical advice to Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, among several nations over his esteemed career. Mike graduated from the US Military Academy at West Point and has had a distinguished military career, including service with the 7th Special Forces Group. I look forward to each of your insights, and I'm now handed over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Chancellor Diermeier. This is such a joy. I want to particularly recommend and appreciate those people that have joined us. We understand there's about 1,500 people online. Share ideas with respect and discourse and dialogue and dignity and a spirit of really inquiry and discovery. You'll rapidly discover, if you're listening, this is an incredible collection of people. There's a lot of talent and time is short. I also want to, before we really get into the meat of what we want to do, recognize two important things that have to stand first. Obviously, our attention is focused on events in Afghanistan, half a world away, but I don't want to forget our neighbors in Waverly with the floods. And we need to do everything we can do to reach out to those people. And of course, second, we're torn at the explosions this morning, both American lives, our allied lives, our Afghan allies, and innocent civilians. We will end this discussion, as we planned yesterday, at the very end with a discussion of what you as the average listener can do to help, bigger picture and in the immediacy. And I also want to commend in this context, the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy. It's really an important effort based on dialogue, based on facts and reason and dignity and respect, where dissent is embraced as an opportunity for learning and inquiry, and not just an opportunity to destroy. After we're done with the conclusion of these comments, at the Vanderbilt Unity Project website, vanderbilt.edu/unity, you will see a listing of many further things that you can do for further reading or further inquiry, as well as some specific links that we've picked out of how you, sitting from home, can help. I've been asked to spend about 5 minutes to frame this debate, and I'll do that quickly. In a way, this entire panel is misnamed, as we've all agreed. It's entitled The Crisis in Afghanistan. The reality is this is a series of overlapping and interlocking crises that feed on each other. There's nothing linear about this entire process. And so our goal is to disaggregate. We don't have terribly much time, but I want to sort of give a quick history and then recount some of the current crises and the ways that we're going to discuss this. In the first instance, the current crisis really began and took off on July the 4th, when the United States essentially abandoned Bagram Air Base, a secure location about 40 miles outside of Baghdad, with all the military architecture that we needed, all the support mechanisms, the air traffic control towers. That was a power projection point from which the United States could conduct both military operations and secure the embassy, et cetera. It was very shortly thereafter that the Taliban began the campaign to retake Afghanistan, province by province, capital by capital, village by village. And just as in Vietnam, the adage is that if you don't control the countryside, you don't control the cities. That's essentially what happened. In Clausewitzian sort of principles of war terms, we lost the initiative. We allowed the Taliban to mass at the key points on their terms and their timing. And we also destroyed the morale and the fighting efficiency of our Afghan military allies, which we'll talk about, why that happened and how it could have been prevented. This is a historical benchmark that might mark actually the end of an American expeditionary model, right? We may be returning back to the balance of power politics of old. We just don't know yet. But in terms of the crises, this absolutely represents what General Petraeus would call a non-biodegradable event. This will not go away. Neither will it be cleaned up quickly. We're in for the long haul here. And so we want to spend a chunk of our time focusing on the future pathways to progress. Let me quickly, in about a minute and a half or 2 minutes, illustrate the range of crises. We've all seen a diplomatic crisis, which is what Summer's going to address right off the top. The diplomatic crisis, the loss of American credibility, the loss in the G7 context, which is a critical counterbalance to Chinese influence. G7 shattered discussions now. We've seen a crisis within NATO and our NATO allies because we didn't consult with them. And we've not reached a unified NATO position and we acted unilaterally. We see a human tragedy unfolding before our very eyes as recently as this morning. The suffering and the devastation is really, really difficult to watch and bear, but it's very, very real. Along with that, just the basics of food and shelter and safety. And in legal terms, we're also facing what we would call a human rights crisis. Persecution of Christians already, persecution of Hazari, which was undertaken in the prior Taliban regime based on their Shiite religion, persecution of women and gender, persecution of the LGBT community, suppression of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. The human rights abuses here are ad nauseum. Lastly, we're facing a structural crisis in the UN because in the 2 decades since 9/11, we've developed a very robust counterterrorism network and a very robust counterterrorism infrastructure, all of which today faces an existential crisis. Remember that we went into Afghanistan in the early days based on a unanimous Security Council resolution, which meant that the Russians and the Chinese supported that resolution. And the Taliban had a very basic fundamental choice: join with the rest of the world in opposing terrorism in all its forms and all its manifestations and eliminate the al-Qaeda influence, or face the wrath of a unified NATO force that will come in to accomplish that goal that you chose to disregard. That's where we were, and in a crazy way, that's where we've circled back today. The Taliban today faces a funding shortage. They face a political crisis in their own right, which we'll talk about. We also face a regional crisis between Pakistan and China. We'll talk about those influences. We'll talk about the Russian influences in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, which have changed in these 2 decades. But I want to first kick to Tom. Tom has a great new book out about Henry Kissinger and the end of the Vietnam era. We're all familiar with Mark Twain's comment that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So Tom, can you talk briefly about the analogies to Vietnam? You know, there's been a lot of press reporting and we've seen helicopters taken off of embassies, which is a very superficial image of that. But what is the reality in terms of comparison to Vietnam?
Well, it's very interesting because in some ways, this comparison was initially invoked by President Biden when he was asked what type of withdrawal we would have. And he said it won't be like South Vietnam. The Taliban are not the North Vietnamese army, and that there will be no sort of frantic evacuation. Well, he was wrong about that because, in effect, there were a number of comparisons between what happened in Vietnam and what happened in Afghanistan. First off, the United States had shaped the Afghan army very much in its image, just as it shaped the South Vietnamese army in its image, particularly the importance of air power and support, which in the case when we cut that off, as we did in June, where a group of Afghan commandos were trying to defend a position and then were there was no support and they were captured by the Taliban and summarily executed, we destroyed the morale. And you have already mentioned that, of the Afghan army. In a different way, the South Vietnamese army also suffered from that. Congress cut off any sort of funding. There was no American air support when the North Vietnamese launched an all-out, full-scale invasion. The Vietnam War did not end as a guerrilla war. It ended as a conventional war, a conventional attack by the North Vietnamese, and the United States stood by. This was largely supported in Congress and by most of the American people not to re-enter. But the result was then that South Vietnam collapsed. Now, there are other comparisons as well. Certainly, the South Vietnamese government was corrupt at various levels as the Afghan government, but it was still better than the North Vietnamese, and the Afghan government was better than the Taliban. There were other comparisons as well with the degree of people who worked for the United States who were in danger of being left behind. If you've seen any of the images from the collapse of Saigon, you've seen the panic as people tried to get to the American embassy, the image of the helicopter taking people away. But in many respects, the evacuation of Saigon was far better planned and in fact took place with much greater order than what seems to be happening in Afghanistan. But I'll stop there. We can go on at other comparisons as well.
Well, that's a perfect place to stop because it segues directly to Summer's expertise, which is the comparative diplomacy here. You know, in diplomatic and humanitarian terms, Summer, what could we have done better? You know, and which is a segue, of course, later we'll talk about what do we do now in the future? Where is our diplomatic pathway forward?
Absolutely. So I'm just going to go into past, present, and future real quick, as you've asked me to do, Mike. And I also just wanted to, before I begin my remarks, say thank you for your remarks on Waverly. Really appreciate it, as that is my hometown. So thank you on that. And also just wanted to emphasize again about how the problem with these wars are people only pay attention when something breaks through in the news cycle, and then they use it to confirm or deny a partisan position. I think it's really important for us to avoid doing that here today, and I just wanted to re-emphasize that. So I think that taking this from a past, present, future framework here, I think that collateral damage built up over time. We've been building a house of cards in Afghanistan for the past 20 years, and we really forgot a key rule: local always wins. So what does that mean? How we are engaging on the ground at the grassroots level we have been engaging on the ground at the grassroots level for the past 20 years with serious inconsistencies. And we've been building a local army there that resembled what an army for the United States looks like and works and is arguably functional, but wasn't functional for the Afghan people. And as you mentioned in your remarks too, Mike, how we were engaging with the countryside was just off. Going back to that point, local always wins. we did not really build diplomatic relationships that were effective on the ground at that grassroots level with consistency. I also think that the State Department coordination with DOD along with the CIA and the various different White House administrations was off. How our internal bureaucracies were coordinating with each other as institutions in and of themselves was off. So the State Department's coordination with DOD along with the CIA was dysfunctional at best. And so that's another key point to just kind of focus on. How did we get this so wrong? It was really also a failure in diplomacy, as I've said, completely. So present, where does that leave us right now? You mentioned the persecution of Christians. You mentioned the persecution of vulnerable minority communities, including women. And I would just also highlight the persecution of Muslims themselves and as well. And so where does that leave us? I think we have to work very closely with our allies. And we have to work to mitigate the human rights violations on an hour-by-hour basis. This is going to take a lot of work, and we have to begin that now. I mean, it starts with talking to key stakeholders and tightening the feedback loop, and that requires diplomatic skills. So we need our top diplomats engaging on this through track 1, track 1.5, and track 2 ways. We also need to focus on immediate aid and relief. And the USAID and the nonprofit sector here is going to be important. And we need to be thinking about what is our plan as to how we're going to provide that relief and how does that tie into our diplomatic efforts as well. And demonstrating that we are a trusted partner, because I think a lot of people are asking questions right now as to which United States are they dealing with here. And evacuation processes and coordination with embassies and ministries of foreign affairs around the world is going to be important. We have to get that right. Details are really going to matter here. And analyzing also, as what we're doing right now as a community, as citizens in America, analyzing what we got right and what we didn't get right is important, and so that we don't continue to commit the same mistakes and avoid slipping into a slippery slope partisan free-for-all. That's just not going to be helpful. Yes, the withdrawal could and should have been smoother. That's putting it lightly, and accountability here is important, and there's enough to go around for each administration going back to Bush 43. I'll just touch on very briefly on the future. Again, I can't stress enough, diplomacy is going to be key, and identifying how we are going to collectively define US interests and protect those interests thoughtfully and in line with our democratic principles and values. This is one of the reasons I think the Project on Unity and American Democracy at Vanderbilt is so important and so timely, so we can get that right. And to think about which Taliban are we dealing with? The Taliban in 2021 is probably not the same Taliban as in 2001. So which Taliban are we dealing with? They say they're going to govern under Sharia law. How are they defining Sharia law? And how are we going to work closely with their allies, which include Qatar, Russia, and China, which we do have diplomatic relations with? And then finally, I think that we need to invest as smart partners in incentivizing ways.
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, from where I sit, you know, where you sit depends on what you see. It doesn't look like the Taliban have been reliable partners at all in terms of.
I don't think they have.
Protect people. And you know, I think you're right in terms of humanitarian access and defending human rights moving forward. We have doctrine on how to do that. We've done non-combatant evacuation operations. We've done humanitarian corridors, which requires assistance with our allies. We know how to do, as we did in Bosnia, safe havens for people, all of which requires, as you correctly point out, a pretty carefully calibrated military, political, diplomatic response. And, you know, that's the challenge going forward. But I want to flip to General Howell. And sir, just to ask you to explain for our audience, some of whom may not really understand the role of the Afghans. And then I want to, after those comments, circle back to this notion of a national government, a centralized power versus the provincial, and sort of pick up some lessons learned, really looking at the way forward. Where do we go from here? But sir, what was the role? Can you explain the Special Immigrant Visa Program and who these people are, and some of the relationships and why that's so important?
Sure, I can. So the Special Immigrant Visa Program has actually been in place since about 2009. It was originally instituted to bring back the Iraqi interpreters and Afghan interpreters that we'd worked so closely with, to reward them, provide security for them and their families after their service with us. Over the years, it had been expanded a little bit. As recently as last month, Congress expanded another 8,000 for a special immigrant visa from Afghanistan up to 34,000. But when you look at the application, it's 8 pages long. It's bureaucratic. It's in English. There's a lot of things that have to get done. And while not seeing the rapid decline of security in and around Kabul and evacuating the embassy, there was just not a way to process that fast enough. So, bureaucracies are designed to keep you from making bad decisions because you're looking at all angles of the problem, but they also keep you from making good decisions quickly. I think that may have been what happened here. We just couldn't keep pace with the decline of the security environment there to process the applications.
But this is not a new problem. I mean, and put a human face on this. How much danger really are the people who are applicable for that? And why can't that program have been expanded in a bureaucratically streamlined way in the same way we did with Vietnamese allies, with the Kurds? There's a large Kurdish community in Nashville. What really was the problem that you saw on the ground? Because this is personal. You and I both have people that we've been helping, some of whom made it out, some of whom haven't. That's right. So we, for a lot of people in the military, a lot of people in the interagency, we spent a significant amount of time in Afghanistan. We have relationships, strong relationships with our Afghan partners. They're with us day in, day out. We're embedded on the ground, their own missions, exposing themselves to the same level of threat that we do. In addition to that, the Taliban know who these people are. They know their families. They routinely provide night letters threatening them if they continue their coordination support of the U.S. forces. And now that we are gone, as you can imagine, the threat they feel is pretty high, and we are very sensitive to that with as much time as we spent with our comrades there, and feel an obligation to them to get them and their families out to keep them safe. I had a judge one time, in the face of death threats personally and some murders of counsel and a lot of human rights violations, he was asked by an NGO, "Why do you keep serving as a judge?" And his answer, metaphorically, which I liked as a lawyer, was, "I serve the rule of law. If I don't fight and you don't fight, then who will?" And a lot of the SIV applicants had more or less that same attitude. Big picture, and this is a question really for all of you, focusing on this national versus provincial, would we have been successful had we adopted a provincial model in the beginning, instead of, as Summer pointed out, trying to superimpose a national federalist system? A good friend of mine just last night said to me, there is no Afghan nationalism. And he's right about that. There's tribal loyalties, there's religious loyalties, there's fragmented loyalties. Would we have been better off creating almost like a National Guard, provincial reconstruction forces, provincial forces, and then trying to have some looser national consensus to tie those things together? What do y'all think about that?
I think it's likely we might have provoked a civil war that way, Mike. We might have created situations in which we had armed various areas and created a situation of National Guard similar to what we did in Latin America during the 1920s and 30s, where we built up civil guards that ended up being the tools of dictators. So I'm not so sure that solution would have necessarily worked. We, in many respects, we are probably condemned toward this notion of a nation state, since that's how we operate, how the international system operates. And while we could have done many, many things better, I'm not sure that one would have done it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think, when people join our military, we don't have to tell them to respect human rights or to obey the chain of command or to not take bribes. We just don't have to do that. It's kind of what they grew up with in the culture here. But in Afghanistan, it's just not that way. They don't have an allegiance as we know it to a constitution, to a civilian chain of command and control of the military. And I think with us being embedded with them every day and they can see that example, it held true. But as we adjusted our footprint over time and weren't embedded at the tactical level, they kind of went back to their tribal and ethnic allegiances. I think that would have been very, very difficult over time with human rights concerns.
I think we're seeing tribal and ethnic allegiances, quite frankly, in almost every nation state around the world right now. So I don't really think that that's unique to Afghanistan. And I think that what we're really seeing is that, as Tom pointed out, is that we have to, we are dealing with a nation state framework. That's how the world is organized. So as such, we actually really need to focus on both a national strategy and a grassroots strategy. But what are we talking about with regards to grassroots? Are we talking about arming and equipping each local province, or are we actually talking about building consensus around positive norm setting values and talking about and getting people to think about what do we want to be moving forward? Who do we want to be moving forward? And that's what I meant when I said about which Taliban are we dealing with right now. I think we can probably make guesses, but I think we also need to observe that the country of Qatar, for example, for almost the past 20 years, in partnership with the United States, have been working with Afghan people on defining what is Sharia law. What does that mean to us? What does that mean to live under it?
That's interesting, because of all the reports coming back now, where you really are seeing a reversion back to the pre-2001 version of Taliban rule. But it's also interesting because in a big picture, I think we're facing a bit of an existential crisis vis-a-vis the Taliban and the transnational terrorist architecture. This will come up in immediate form, whether the Russians and the Chinese recognize a terrorist government. And if they do, as a formal act of recognition, and here I'm setting the groundwork to shift to the Chinese, because we talked about this, we want to talk about pending Chinese influence. But if the Russians and the Chinese actually do recognize the Taliban and pressure, for example, the IMF to release funds, and begin to sell oil, as the Iranians are already doing, and begin to support this government, even in the face of egregious and massive human rights violations, it really does send a shockwave through the international system and the international terrorism architecture. So Tom and anybody, what do y'all think about the Chinese now? Because there's a lot to be said here.
I think they'll be more cautious than taking an immediate step in this direction. China is very much conscious of its national interest. It has some concerns about the Taliban's relationship with its own suppressed Uyghur population, and the idea that there might be some attempt by Afghanistan or within Afghanistan to help the Uyghurs against the persecution of the Chinese state is exercising. I think they're more than happy to use the example of Afghanistan as a way to intimidate Taiwan, rather than necessarily to jump right in. That will be, I think, Mike, you're absolutely right, that will be an interesting marker at what point China decides to recognize. I think that's less a question with Russia, where I think there'd be less of an immediate issue there, but I think China will be more cautious.
I just wanted to add on the, yeah, go ahead, General.
Yeah, I'll add there as well. You know, I think Tom's right. And China will be very careful. They've watched us closely over the last 20 years, and some of the mistakes that have happened. There have been some outreach. There's a small shared border in the northeast of Afghanistan and China, in the district or province of Badakhshan. There was an attempt between China and Afghanistan to form a joint brigade to provide security in that area. And for a host of reasons and tribal allegiances and ethnic problems, it didn't work out. So I think they'll be very careful before they dip their toe into this too deeply. They are very interested, however, in the extraction of the minerals. You know, in one of my recent trips to Afghanistan, there's a 10,000-foot runway there built by the Chinese to start mining. We will see how that works for them. You know, normally their model is to bring Chinese labor in. So how will they extract the minerals while bringing value to the local villages around there by hiring Afghan labor?
I think the Chinese are going to be opportunists. I think if there's one word that we can use to describe how the Chinese are going to behave, it's going to be as opportunists. And that means absolutely around minerals, and also around the US's place in the world right now as they rise and become more powerful and share the center stage with us. And so what does that mean for us? And I think that gets to this other point that you brought up, Mike, which is war on terror. This is the war on terror, 20 years on. What's worked? What hasn't worked? What are we going to do over the next 20 years on this? And what is US foreign policy? What are our national security interests? Do we have agreement? Do we have bipartisan agreement around that? Are we able to be clear with our allies and with our trusted partners right now on who we are moving forward? And can we speak with one voice? Are we speaking with one voice? Are we clear? Are we reliable? Are we consistent?
It's interesting because, boy, so much comes to mind. When you say, are we clear, are we reliable? I see the face of Najib and Faraz and Farad and the men and women with whom we worked, who counted on that reliability, who counted on our relationships, who counted on our trust, trusted us with their lives, entrusted their families with their lives, and we have abandoned them. We have doctrine on how to do non-combatant evacuation operations. We know how to do this, typically with the Marines, but in this instance, in military terms, it violated every military doctrinal practical principle about how to do non-combatant evacuation operations. And I think you're right. And in a sense, the problem now is that we have a resurgence of Al-Qaeda, ISIS terrorism, and the recreation of a stable, safe haven home base. And as we saw in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the urgent, everybody right now today is thinking about bombings this morning, and the response squeezes out the critically important. I think you're right. It's time for some hard lessons in terms of what has worked and what hasn't worked. And here to our listening, our home studio audience, I would commend some of the resources. I'll say it again, Vanderbilt.edu/Unity will be the website. After we're done, exactly what Summer was discussing will be posted in PDF form that you can download some of the really critical analyses of this 20-year military diplomatic strategic pathway. And it's a good sort of hard set of lessons learned and observations in terms of ahead. Yeah.
May I add here that I do think one thing we've seen in the case of Afghanistan is an odd case of bipartisan agreement. In effect, President Trump and President Biden agreed that we should get out of Afghanistan. And in that sense, there was a type of bipartisan agreement. And I think the initial inclination of the Biden administration was to use the withdrawal of Afghanistan for political purposes, namely to celebrate September 11th as kind of the end of America's endless wars and to play on that. My research tends to argue that American foreign policy is strongly shaped by its domestic politics. In this case, I think the domestic politics, of course, led to a complete disaster because the attempt to do something political avoided taking into consideration both military and intelligence analysis that would have steered us in a different direction. So I think in this sense, there was a bipartisan consensus, but it was one that led to disaster.
That's interesting. And I want to ask, well, go ahead, Summer, please.
I was going to say it's the how part. I think the how piece, how we withdrew is what there was agreement on withdrawal, but how we did it. And I think we really have to focus on that as well. Yeah. And I think also about going back to Mike's point too, how we are countering terrorism, how we're going to be doing that, the ways in which we do it. I do think we need to build consensus across the partisan divides on that and come to an agreement.
Well, there's no question. If anything, persistent terrorist attacks, at least from Mike Newton's seat in Mike Newton's office in the safety of Vanderbilt Law School, is that continuing terrorist attacks absolutely ought to unify us to stand firm in the face of evil, to stand for human dignity, to stand for human rights, and do everything individually and collectively and politically to facilitate those objectives. That to me is one of the problems here in the how. Tom is right that the surveys show the American people and the bipartisan agreement is very strong that it was time to pull back. But it's the how and the implementation of that has really undercut diplomatic trust, even in NATO, even among the G7, even among our strongest allies. And when the United States loses that, it really opens up the door both for China, obviously, but also for Pakistan to extend its presence. It undermines the Iranian negotiations. It undermines Middle East regional stability. It undermines us in other areas. And I think we need to put a very, very bright spotlight on immediately linking military capacity or rebuilding military capacity with diplomatic will. And in this sense, General Howell, I want to ask you, sir, one of the criticisms that I've heard is that, going back to Summer's observation, that we didn't fight a 20-year war. We fought a series of one-year wars that just lasted 20 years because of the lack of regional knowledge, the lack of cultural affiliation, the constant movement of people in and out. And in doing so, of course, we stressed the force because particularly the special operators and the ones with particular technical expertise went back 4 and 5 and 6 times, but they went back under constrained conditions and in different. So how do we fix that problem so that we're going to maximize our military capacity going forward in order to support our diplomacy?
Well, that's a great question. This comes back to the ends, ways, and means. We changed maybe changed the ends a bit. We certainly changed our ways several times throughout that. So the consistency will be the key piece. But as you said, there's been a critique about, we fought a series of 1-year wars, but for most of the people, certainly in the special operations community, they've done rotation after rotation. I know several folks who have in excess of 4 or 5 years in Afghanistan, and sometimes going back into the same little area, the same valley where they have the relationships where we can kind of bring value. So, that back to the counterterrorism piece, that's the fear now with us withdrawing is, does Afghanistan become a rallying cry for the violent extremist organizations to all rush back in and become a petri dish for more terrorism? In my experience, there's kind of 2 things that keep terrorism at bay. 1 is good governance, and 2 is counterterrorism pressure. And if there's no pressure, it doesn't mean that good governance is going to flow. So this is going to be very key to watch Afghanistan, and it'll be very difficult with no military there to actually understand and know what's going on the ground.
In that vein, I wonder how y'all feel about the fact that we could have gone about this by saying, we're ending the war in Afghanistan, and in the military terms, we're putting the focus on good governments, ending corruption, being hard on our allies, both the NATO allies and our Afghan allies. But in order to maintain the capacity that we need, we're going to hold on to Bagram Air Base with a defensible perimeter, 2,500 people, which is a much smaller footprint, which gives special operations forces, which gives USAID a secure entry and exit point. It facilitates relations with our allies. Do y'all think the American people would have stood for that?
I think they would have if the president had explained it in that sense. The United States had not had any casualties for over a year. One of the strong contrasts between the Afghanistan and Vietnam situation is there was not the sort of huge public opposition to the continuing of the war. There was, of course, the polling, but it was not intense. It was not the way in which people really felt very, very strongly against the Vietnam War. So Nixon, when he ended the Vietnam War with the Paris Peace Treaty, had to pull out all American forces. We couldn't leave a small residual force. That was part of the agreement to get the POWs back. We had to pull out completely. And I think in this case, they could have retained a small force that would have secured, and that would have provided, I think, a morale boost for the Afghan army and a chance to continue at least a type of stalemate. I think the sacrifice of that stalemate was a critical mistake.
And I think that gets to another point, and that's communication. Just kind of bringing it back to basics, how we are communicating our foreign policy to the American public in real time. That's really concerning. And so I think we need to focus on that. And it will do us a lot of good to do that and to think about effective communication, particularly in the age of social media that's riddled with dis and misinformation. So how do we effectively communicate? And then that will also then help us communicate with our allies in the rest of the world. And I wanted to just bring to piggyback on something that General Howell said too, and that is this Petri dish concern, which is absolutely a concern. And I think that gets to what are the alternatives for people on the ground to the Taliban? And what do investing in those alternatives look like in effective ways, especially if we're not going to be having diplomatic relations with the central government there? How do we partner with people that we still have diplomatic relations with, who will have diplomatic relations with the central government?
Well, I mean, I had a friend of mine describe to me the other day, which was new information to me. And General Howell, I'd like you to comment on this in terms of how it works on the ground. In terms of reinforcing our diplomacy. But the notion was that because of the divides in Afghanistan and the tribal and religious and regional, constituent Afghan unit had to have ethnic representation cross-balance. So you had one Tajik, you had a Pashtun, and then, you know, if the neighboring battalion had a Pashtun commander, you had to have other representation, merely to prevent mistreatment and human rights abuses within that force as the bare minimum of making it a combat effective force. Paired with that, though, and this is where General Howell's observation about American oversight and American logistics support was so important, you had to have the support. You know, the report out of Kandahar was that they surrendered en masse when they ran out of ammunition, because we pulled their logistics supply chain from them literally overnight. So General Howell, I mean, take up Summer's point of how we do this better moving forward.
Well, one of the points you mentioned is spot on there about the need for ethnic balance, and most of the general officer appointments in the Afghan army for all my time over there were approved by the president, and it got to that level to ensure that ethnic balance. So you don't have a purely Pashtun division or a purely Tajik division who might go off on their own way. So they watch that very, very carefully. It's kind of a smoothing function to have the different views with it in each unit. But that's very hard to do. And when you look at overall the whole Afghan security forces, the Pashtuns are underrepresented. And most of these were, you know, young Tajiks who might have been born up in the north and now they're deployed down to Helmand in a Pashtun area. So when things start to decay a little bit, their allegiance is back to their home and tribe, and they're going back home. So that's, you know, it's having us there kind of kept the cohesion tight. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Of course, the Taliban's going to have a little bit of a problem now. It's easy when you're the party out of power to critique. Now they'll be charged with providing security. In today's explosion, you know, with Taliban casualties there, it'll be interesting to see if they can do that.
Well, I just got a news report that we also lost 4 Marines today, 4 United States Marines. So this is close to home, and this is not theory. This is the real world. And I think we need to stand firm along with our friends and allies. And this is one of the major focuses of the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy, is to cross partisan lines, to get away from the, you know, look past the politics and the punditry and go back to core American values in the face of countering terrorism, but doing it in a way that really is true to our values. And here, it's interesting because, you know, you also run the possibility, a good friend of mine described the Afghan national pastime as civil war with brief eruptions, right? So there's a real possibility now. When the Russians came in, of course, the psychological term is common enemy intimacy, right? They had a common ally, and it made them cohere across those otherwise fragmented lines. Do we see any possibility of that happening now in Afghanistan, so that you could have relative division and relative peace in parts of the country where you have freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, LGBT rights, female rights, education, girls' schools? I just saw the entire girls' school was evacuated to Rwanda. But they ought not to have to go to another country to be educated, in my personal opinion. So is there any possibility of some regional, for lack of a better word, segmentation that might be a valid way forward? What do y'all think?
Yes, absolutely. I think all hope is not lost here. And I think that we have to, exactly what you're talking about, Mike, and that is we've seen this, and we've been having these conversations about our policies in Syria and about Iraq and other places too. And I think that what we really have to think about is, as General Howell said, about the need for ethnic balance. How do you do that? Into that how part. How do we do that in 2021, in the 21st century? We can learn from past lessons of how we did that, but we also are in the middle of what we call the 4th Industrial Revolution here. And we have to be thinking about how we relate to each other, how we communicate, and how societies evolve with time. And how does that work? It doesn't happen overnight. And I just wanted to stress, there are countries in the Middle East who have been working and who have continued to be working with women's rights groups and with other groups to try to move that society in a more positive norm-setting direction. And I think we need to look at that and to see what programs have already been created, what's working, what's not working, what could work, and then how can we help? Where, again, going back to that point, where do we invest? Who do we invest in? Who are our partners that we trust and are reliable? And what does success look like, short-term, medium-term, and long-term?
I would also say there's a sort of good news and bad news by looking at history. Vietnam became, after the communist takeover, for the next 10 years, it was consumed with war in Cambodia, war in China, It impoverished the country. The communist rule from the north impoverished the country. It went from a net exporter of rice to a need to import, until finally there became a sort of pressure to begin to change and open to the outside world. And it seemed to me one of the great ironies of yesterday's or the past week is that here we have this awful situation going on in Afghanistan, and Vice President Harris is in Vietnam now, talking with a country that is now collaborating with us. Interesting that the Taliban are now saying they want to hold on to some of the people that are educated, engineers and the rest. Of course, those people are also very scared about how they're going to be treated. They could contribute to the reconstruction, but this will be a genuine test of whether the Taliban has any room for a different group of Afghanis who might want more education, and for women as well. This is one of those things that I think is going to be an interesting test. The interesting case of Vietnam is that it did take quite a while before this change took place, but that their seeds have been planted that may cause the Taliban difficulty in ruling in the long run.
Yeah, I agree. I share Summers' view. There's a case for optimism here. For the last 20 years, we've had some successes. Girls have gone to school. They've been more inclusive, so they have seen that. You can't put this genie completely back in the bottle. In the early days, as cell phones spread around Afghanistan, the Taliban would destroy the cell phone towers because they did not want the outside world reaching into these villages. That's going to be hard to do. And I think, particularly with the international community watching them closely, they're going to have to moderate their behavior, in my view.
Well, that's interesting, sir. I want to push you on that just a bit. Because you've had more than any of us direct observation of Taliban influences in the villages, in the countryside, where the journalists are not, the journalists are driven out, where there's not free reporting. Tell us what hope you see that the Taliban can do that in the countryside where it really matters. How do they secure loyalty and a functioning economy? Because that's, to me, one of the huge problems that they face right now. They do not have the money to run any kind of government, and it's hard to see where they get it, which means that the principle is on them to run it. Sir, what hope do you see there?
That's a great one. The Taliban first kind of rose to power down there because the government was corrupt, and they came in as supposed to be the honest broker sitting around and having a shura to mediate disputes and to work through things. Over time, as they got in power, they started to abuse that. So we will see. That's going to be the key thing. And as you mentioned, with all the international money flowing into Afghanistan and fueling their economy right now, if we close our embassy and everybody pulls out, what's going to happen to U.S. funding? What's going to happen to NATO funding? And they're going to have a tough road to hoe on governance. And
in that line, go ahead, Summer.
I was just going to say, I think that's why I'm talking about when I'm saying smart investments. What are we enabling? And being very strategic about that. I don't think we yet have a plan around that, but I think we need to get one quickly. And exactly on, because what we don't want is to choke every Afghan person who's living there who really is in need of international help and supplies and relief. So we need to think strategic, going back to this whole point, what are our values? What are our principles? And let our actions speak for themselves. And so I think we're kind of be thinking about and having about what are our actions, and also not giving hope. And this is going to sound idealistic, but you have to have a little bit of idealism here. Not giving up hope on the power of the individual and what they want.
Right, but let me push you on that just a bit, and we're very close to time. So remember, everybody, and for the people that were watching, we will end with about 2 or 3 minutes, very short comments, very pointed on what the average American citizen can do to help. We've seen the EU shut off funding already. We've seen NATO shut off funding. We've seen the IMF shut off funding. And one of the problems strategically for the United States now is the Taliban is, and in my view, should remain, a specially designated terrorist organization, which kicks in a huge range of legal barriers to funding them. So one of the things that I see going forward is a lot of Americans, private Americans, who want to go to Afghanistan, who want to help, but will run into those legal barriers in
Absolutely.
terms of terrorism. And there's no easy way around that. So I want us to focus as a policy matter on being very practical in terms of either exceptions or waivers on a very narrow basis, but they have to be controlled. They have to be monitored. They have to be very precise. Otherwise, and as we're seeing, you know, the government, in our government, ends up being a barrier to effective action on the ground. And if we
That's what I'm talking about with enabling. That's what I mean when I'm saying
the
enabling.
SIV comment. You know, the Special Immigrant Visa Program is a huge problem. It's been a huge problem. It's a multi-administration problem. To me, there's a very visible breach of faith. The law professor word is ineffable. It's hard to describe it. It's very real. It's very powerful. This bond of trust with the people that have helped us in this setting. It is intolerable to me that our State Department and our national security apparatus has not solved that problem in the last 15 years. And the one thing I want to see coming out of this now is a responsive government, because if you poll Americans, they're going to say, we want to help the people that have helped us. Our government is not being responsive. The SIV process right now, the Special Immigrant Visa, was described, it's a 14-step process, and it's like the tumblers of a lock. You have to get the first one, and before you get the first and the second one, you have to get the first one, and then you're working your way up to the seventh, but they're time limited. So now the first two don't count anymore, and you have to start again, and you have to go to this website and talk to this person. But General Howell retired. I gave you his statement, but you have to find General Howell again and give him another one. We have got to demand accountability from our government to fix this problem. And it's a multiple administration, multiple Secretary of State problem. What do y'all think of that?
I think we could put a considerable amount of pressure on the government to target the type of aid or opportunities for aid around the idea of particularly of getting out the Afghans who have supported and helped us. They seem, I think there's no question that we're going to abandon a large number of Afghans in the next few days. That's not it. I don't think that's even an issue. So we would need to use some of the tools that we might have through aid and other opportunities for the Taliban in economic terms to try and get them to respond to these human rights questions.
I agree on the SIV as well. You know, when you have the bureaucracy is not designed for something that's this pressurized. So in crisis, there's opportunity as well. Now is the time that pressure could be applied to speed up that process.
Absolutely. And it also goes into our conversation around immigration visas and policies in general.
Well, it struck me because, and I agree with Summer, it's about who we help and how we help. But the who, I just want to stress again, these are real people. These are real families. These are women across Afghanistan today that have been told to stay home. They cannot leave their house today while the Taliban create the structure and the rules by which they may leave their house. And that's only one example. You know, in our experience, and General Howell has been busy the last few days helping people with limited success. He's seen firsthand the bureaucratic obstacles and the barriers. I think here's where we need to demand of our government, good government. Thomas Jefferson was in one of his letters wrote that the least we can demand of our government is honesty. And when we're on the ground and we promise an Afghan or an Iraqi or a Yazidi that we're going to help them, and that the trust and the good faith of the United States government stands behind them, that's a solemn vow. That's a promise. The law professor word is ineffable. It's a virtual poem. It's very powerful. And in many ways, we have betrayed that promise. So here we're rapidly approaching, and gosh, I wish we could go on all afternoon. What great people. If you're watching, I would reiterate to you again for the third time, Vanderbilt.edu/unity is where you'll be able to get the tape of this, as well as hot links to resources, hot links to refugee agencies, etc. If you want to help at home. And that is the final question. We'll go around General Howell, Tom, Summer, and then I'll close. If for somebody sitting at home that wants to help, what's your recommendation? What's your preference, please?
Thanks, Mike. I'd have two. So as you mentioned, there is a self-organizing group of individuals who have been leaning into it any way possible to help Afghans get out, either to help them navigate a safe passage to Hamid Karzai International Airport to board, or find other ways to get out. I think that will continue. Even if the 31 August deadline remains in place, there will still be a lot of Afghans who will want to leave and who we owe allegiance to after this. So I think I would keep a watch on that. What non-governmental organizations or what other groups are forming to help that? That would be a way to help. And secondly, I would say is, pretty soon we're going to start to see a good number of Afghans coming to the United States here. And these folks risked everything. They risked their time with us and they're associated with the United States. And secondly, you know, they could have gotten a call in the middle of the night. Hey, come to the airport now. Now is the time. Bring your family, bring whatever money you have. Everything else they left behind. So they're going to arrive here with nothing. And providing them a structure and bringing them into the fabric of this nation, it goes back to, you know, some of the folks that came out of Vietnam in 1975 are some of the best citizens we have, most enthusiastic about the opportunities here in the United States. You know, I would like to see that same type of example with the Afghans who'll be settling here. Thank you.
Tom?
I agree very much with what the general said, what Scott said. I want to add, I've also asked Summer already about this myself, and she gave me some interesting suggestions. Let me just stress one from my point of view. I think there is a fair amount of political cynicism that exists that says we're not going to care about this after August 31st, that once it's off the screens, once American reporters aren't there, we won't care. No one, that's the American attention span is 3 seconds long, this sort of thing. I think what would be really crucial would be to write and to email and to text congressmen, senators, these figures, to let them know that you care. You care about Afghans, you care about how this withdrawal has been carried out, that you care about the treatment of immigrants, particularly, and those and to try to get rid of the bureaucracy, to get out people who helped us. But I think that there has to be a certain amount of political noise, because I was struck by a Congress person saying recently, well, I haven't gotten any mail about that, or I haven't gotten any emails about that. I think this would be a really important thing, is simply to pester our representatives to make them know that this actually does matter. We often say foreign policy doesn't matter in elections and that, and it may very well be true. But I think this is a very human question, the fate of many people. And I think we should make sure that our representatives know that this matters to us.
Good. We're short on time.
So I know. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to say I could not agree more on that point. And it's going back to a lot of people around the world, regardless of who their governments are, what they're doing. I'm convinced that a lot of people around the world want to see the United States be successful. And what I mean by that, they want to see our rights and they want to see our principles and our respect for human rights win. And so that is why these next 6 to 9 months of our actions are so important and so critical. And I'll be very brief on my suggestions on what you can do at home. If you're a lawyer, provide pro bono advice to Human Rights First around the SIV program. If you're a doctor, provide medical relief at a free clinic servicing the influx of people coming in from Afghanistan in your local area right now, including mental health needs. If you're passionate about women's rights, donate to Women International or Vital Voices. Or you can also donate to the International Rescue Committee, as they are currently raising $10 million in life-saving aid for Afghans around the world right now. And then lastly, I encourage you to have a conversation with friends and family over the weekend about what you think as a US citizen regarding the past 20 years in Afghanistan and what has been done in our name. This is actually important for the functionality of our democracy.
Now, let me just say in that point that what our government has done in Afghanistan, whatever period you want to pick, over the last 20 years, over the last 2 years, over the last 2 weeks, in my view, does not reflect the will of the American people entirely. Because America, as I know it, is good. We're generous. We help people. We stand for human rights. We stand for dignity. We stand for freedom of speech and freedom of education. The most effective, and we've all said this, but I wanted to reiterate it, at least from my perspective, the most effective thing we can do to help right now as individual citizens is to show people what America really looks like. We need to find food. We need to find shelter. We need to find housing. We need to help people get licenses. We need to help people learn English. We need to help people get out of Afghanistan that want to get out of Afghanistan. That means both political pressure, it means regional pressure, and I'll close with my core technical expertise. We also need to stand united with our allies and with those good-hearted people around the world and stand firm in the face of fear and terrorism and injustice. That's what America is for. And I think if there's one slight sliver of good news out of all this, it reminds us who we are and what we're all about. We stand in opposition as a bipartisan effort to confront evil in the world. And with that, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Chancellor and the center for sponsoring this talk. We appreciate your time.